When I wake, the trill of an alarm falls around me. In seconds, there is a brain curled behind my eyes and the jolt of a few disparate thoughts, which scatter and wink out. In a moment I bloom, crumple, and sag, and then it is the next moment. I am in a bed, my own. There is a grey duvet that I am underneath, this being the first thing I recognize to be real, and suddenly so. Downstairs, in the hallway, there is a calendar, a compact Rolodex of daily motivational sentiments and quotes, and yesterday's will still be there. Stop lashing yourself. The dregs of some dream previously inhabited collect and vanish. I am naked and find that I can move. However, in doing so, I graze against some unseen latch within me, which slides and comes to a halt with the signal of a migraine. A near imperceptible weight comes to rest on my brain. In an instant, the day before me is swept lazily away and replaced with a coastal dread. How, I ask myself, could this have happened when there are people talking, walking about the world like it was nothing? There is a retraction of the lungs as my lips prise open, as though they have just kissed. My body continues in its processes, the wanton circulation of blood, the digestion and absorption of nutrients. I can hear these things, symphonic, battling around my innermost self. I flirted with functioning, and even on a good day living, all for something, some intention, one long since forgotten, now recalled, self-extinction. A black, opaque cloud, around which the inside of my skull orbits, spills its contents into the body. It pulses through the night, an unending heart that has traveled to my head. Now it's in my neck, and then my arm, a dark worm flexing, articulating between sinews and the veins, constricting the bodily fibers. Now it's behind the shoulder blade, a pilot fish suckling at my senses, grazing fauna in an ecosystem of pain. My back a map of it, the armatures of the nerves outstretched, catching its radio snow. I have inhabited it now for thousands upon thousands of hours. Incurable, I give myself an orgasm in the dark, though the darkest of porn has now become boring, if only to remind myself that pleasure is possible, so that I could believe the tens and tens of doctors that have told me I am perfectly healthy and should really go home and think about my priorities. I'm not saying it's a good thing that I am on opioids again. It's just that there are no seasons in the plywood attic that I haunt. White walls that taunt as I twist like a branch over the sheets, another jobless, if gifted invalid, uninvited to the adult world, but held just as accountable for what I cannot control, and even more so for what I can, having only that over if I'll make the journey from one side of the room to another. A blank CV gapes over the choices one was forced and not forced to make. Seeds of salt sown, decisions of my own, to live with but on which one cannot live for long. September has its suns, but their beams are bleached, splitting through the cold. A nervous system symphony that's 28 years old. The Spirit of God, or is it my own, hovers over the bed, from which I see everything through a cracked phone cocked in my hand. a window into the outside world and the doom within it fit to burst, reflecting the contents of my scalp to which time has now molded, animate, barbed wire coiled around the fire that has replaced the tissues, scorching them like earth. Somehow it cannot kill me, not when I am sustained by the shame I have carefully nurtured, by the overwhelming grief for the life I thought I had been living, for the way in which I thought life worked. Once, on a day I felt well enough to leave the house on a cane, an old man who attended my family's church approached me, conversationally prophesying that the root of my illness lay underneath my bed as he was moved to do so. I looked and found nothing but one discarded estrogen pill. I knew, of course, that the bed he spoke of was me, my body but one more sedimentary layer over the mattress like the Princess and the Pea. In any case, 74 milligrams of either heaven or tramadol is in my blood now, reifying it, a chemical facsimile of healing. For nearly 5 years I let myself become dependent because nothing else would help. I felt myself levitate off the violent kilter of the body, in whose gut were lodged those pills whose peace I've not known since, until I am dead, of course, until I shed all my earthly attachments and utterly ascend into the migraine, my dark co-pilot, the only one who will never leave me. Through me wages the rages and the burning of the pages of the story I had to tell myself, convincing me I'm me, however immolated and transformed under an absent Bodhi tree. There was a point at which I forgot what it felt like to be well, and in that moment my eyes were opened, light beaming through them like hot pokers thrust into a crocus, lightning through a tree, still somehow bearing fruit, mother of pearl sky, the cradle of the sea, directions of the winds, their simultaneity, their many sieves the trees and me, never a part of anything. May my body cross the bedline, approximating waking. May the day be kind when I am not, familiar the aching. I went to sleep for a couple of years. I watched myself from a great height. My dimensions had changed, life continuing to do its ugly thing, leaving me a surface now featureless. Insanity slipped in quietly among the crowded self, mingling with the body's gathered limbs, vibrating among them at contagious frequencies. A master predatory host initiating an orgy of pain. There I was again, dancing with the end, like I had never escaped it at all, because life was so painful, as were the things I did to avoid it, everything it took to keep my shadow tucked behind me, but close, lest I should be free of it. That I may arbitrate its coming and its going can only be maintained by its constant proximity to me. Why should I not feel in control? I did not think it would manifest this, cycling from the bed to the basin to the bath, scalding and freezing oneself to feel anything but this. I just about experienced sunlight filling a room. I spent my days practicing disappearing, ever in the moment, whose occupation had always escaped me anyway, from which I may have divined a life that I may yet want to live, but cannot wait any longer for. It was never really mine. I was saving it for a rainy day, for when I was a pearl in the ground, fallen out of time itself. Somewhere over the edge I teetered, gazing into sheer space, divining a future from the expanse, daring not to sever the analgesic tethers that keep me in proximity to the world. I gazed into a skylight, perfectly angled as the sun met the suburbs. The magnolia paint split like a rose. I watched it with a heavy heart from over the OLED. The glinting of the window full of sun bounced light back up to the day-like sky, the nervous system dictating the profound stasis necessary to see it fade grade by grade like the hours stolen from me. There might yet have been life in which the body was ensnared. A struggling fly, suspended and signaling its fate to itself. What a gift life was! The distant memory of health still forming beads in the trembling web over the glass, catching the sun like prey, illuminating the ravaged pain tracks leading from the spine to the brain, from the cradle to the grave. I wept beneath the glare of the screen, if not the self. Another year in bed. Another me I thought I'd be by then. I wanted to have good news to tell, and to believe it too. My next hope is enough now that nothing is real. The sea performed a view from where I was. The clouds resumed their surveillance. It was beautiful, if only I was there. I remember a prefabricated building swinging above the garden, the crane a clock hand swerving over our semi-detached. My father sat nearby, still alive, his talent for inhabiting the moment left uninherited, the guitar producing its sonic vibrations as only he could play, unskilled and perfect. How was I so unhappy, looking up at the starkest of blues, myself rich with time, like only illness could afford? It struck me then, as it has continued to strike me, that I wanted to rid myself of every thought I've ever had. Each rumination poisoning what is with what might have been. Hope, the virus, preventing acceptance. To whatever end? I had decided that I had done this to myself. Now the sun splits the tortoise-shell sunglasses on a stranger's face, today's migraine having softened, if only for the pills, and for less than an hour. But I've been alive all this time, and I'm just now remembering. My body is the crust of a deep volcano, its very threat implied by its dormancy. Now it's overcast, and I'm on a bus through the awful silicon docks. But the sun might as well be shining. I might as well be free. In fact, now that I think of it, I've never been sick. I am the picture of me, if you can call that health. I'm scared of the good days too. I'm looking for something to go wrong. There's a morbid relief when it does, and I don't have to think, just feel angry like I've never been angry, even though I've always been. I'm nothing but what I am in that moment, and then that self is lost, and I know that when it is, they'll think, you can't be that sick. But I am. Almost skipping through the O'Connell Street crowd because of how happy I happened to be. And I was sick. I still can't quite reconcile the two, each seeming otherwise to be sustained by their very opposition. The afternoon swelling beneath the moment with whatever might happen, from which then the pain returns, taking its place among events, passing over the torso in a mockery of the sun. I deliriously take a taxi home. I used to go into the city, indulge that I was a part of it, part of all of this, and not just another aperture winking and overflowing with the world, unable to contain it. Nothing penetrates me, save for the occasional man, jolting me to momentary life, one that ends before it begins, when the birdsong outside infers an outside at all. Another day I became overwhelmed at Specsavers. A simple transaction somehow became a source of inner contingency. I looked into my own iris and thought, this is it. I am finally going off the rails. I should have been more prepared than most for the lockdowns of 2020 and then 2021, and yet I'm somehow not quite ready to return to the world. Something changed in me that year. I could almost count every cell that's been shed in the 7-year cycle of the body. 7 years, by the way, since the pain came. I've inhabited this hurricane for give or take 1,500 hours this year alone, and few meaningfully believed it. Myself perhaps least of all. The air flexed and morphed from day to day, and all I could do from the eye of the bed-bound spiral was assume that I had orchestrated it. Perhaps if only to empower myself with that assumption. It was easier to conceive that if I was a liar, then I was somehow in control, and could one day experience the sweet release of confession, and be absolved with a normal life, and be someone totally unlike myself, than to be as subject to the storm as the land itself. Then the idea that for that long and longer I haven't been here at all, however vigilant I have stayed. I feel the whole of life force itself into me. I'm just a throat being suffocated from within. I wouldn't have gone on if it weren't for knowing death, how its properties leave artifacts in those left behind, how it gets into your possessions like dust, making you sicker, and it's contagious. But then, so is laughter in the kitchen. So can be a person themselves. So are those few things you cling to because you think they're yours. Because you're able to think that they're yours. The illusion of choice can be a cure. But now I lose myself to the algorithm. A screen blazing through my fingers, tracing the well-worn route from app to app, their simultaneous events sustained in random access memory, trapped in a sequence, trapped in a sequence, trapped in a sequence, trapped in a sequence which from the darkness I scry. My naked father stood over me as a child in the middle of a night like this, lifting me up and shaking me, screaming, I can only resurrect him in the cranial nerve, whose propensities we shared in the migraine. Our pitch-black gene erupting, mutually hallucinating family, a box of anodyne in a drawer, and a question, what, according to the Bible, is the greatest sin? And I remember it forever. Hardness of heart. I've understood since that happiness is a red herring, perched above me like an astral projection, its song heralding morning, however dark. The futility of sleep in the wake of my resident ache. I make my monthly payments to Grunenthal, the same pharmaceutical that birthed the children of thalidomide. I shit red and brown water, if at all, looking up again for Saturn from the toilet. I once thought the doctor who prescribed the opioids was kind, and maybe in fact he was, but the posters lining his surgery were also manufactured by Grunenthal. It may ruin my life someday, it may already have done so, but I'm busy, considering I'm not going anywhere, and neither is Pluto. Like it, my days are longer than most. No more lost among the earth's sound than anything else. A Venus-like atmosphere descending on me like the hands of a pastor from New Zealand down onto my past. A 14-year-old child rising from a beige corduroy couch, convinced of their sins yet to be made. The muted cream tones of the Christian counselor's office promising a calm as he told me that I was possessed by a demon. Just months before, I'd stood naked before a throng of teenage boys, whose laughter filled the locker room like a balloon. My head meeting the walls like a desk, another kid's arms around me as he thrust, jeered on and whispering in my ear, "You like that, don't you, faggot?" Only earlier that morning I had realized that I was going to hell, which miraculously was bright blue. The swimming pool a mouth without a throat, into which dove and was caught a young man like Judas in the 9th circle, his Adonis belt cast above trunks in a prophetic arc,
whose beauty I could only interpret as the devil's as I ran through gymnasium halls and out into the world, forgiving them like I was taught, in what I could only understood as a test from God.
My father's ministry took place in the tilting metal hull of a bus, behind whose rippling glass his lungs were crushed beneath the wheel. An accident leading my mother back to God through a telephone. I learned about the mark of the beast in a hotel function room our church rented out when I was 11. A PowerPoint, muddily projected, terribly photoshopped slides telling of biochips in people's heads and the Antichrist's potential identities. In perhaps the sowing of an anarchic seed, I understood my fear as a call to arms. Now in my 28th year, I miss God. I miss rolling across a converted barn's floor as a child at Bible camp, weeping and worshipping and speaking in tongues. I still pray at times. To my once earthly father, too. It's not that the heavenly one doesn't listen, it's that I don't. I'm too afraid of what answers I think I'll get. We discovered the contents of my father's lungs, and the possibility that he would pass into the air, following the cigarette smoke that would only ever leave him. For 43 years he tried to catch it, casting his bronchiolic net, only to be ensnared himself. The end was arrhythmic. Some flecks deep in the air pulsed and a peach moon rose, activating the night sky, a navy machine into which his spirit slid, a starry gear turning. It was the familiar and dull spur of having been abandoned again. The realization of the rate at which one is abandoned in life, not simply by people, but by moments, the perforations through time behind which coils the infinite. It was also, one learned, with startling resignation, that memories are, and grow ever more so with the passage of time, how things are truly experienced. They never stay the same for long, for in the remembering they are further embellished by desire, by bias, by resentment, and before long they stand as something new. They become the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, a parody of one's life, and then another, and then another. Perhaps that is reincarnation. Grief is a nervous sheet, its dimensions rippling on time like web, a drum skin catching pain's ever-shifting time signature. I'm told to talk about it, but words erode the air. Their vibrations wound the space, and I'd rather take a breath that I meant than cut it and myself on language, though language was how the world was made. Dad drove me up the walls, up Killiney Hill in the dark, to the phosphorescent haze of the old car park, where I would drop acid a decade later in response to my first HIV scare, and shortly after that, develop chronic pain. We spoke about what it meant to be saved. I'd always wondered what subatomic shift would lamely jerk into motion at that moment in the body. When Christ would appear in the twinkling of an eye, heaven then simply a waiting game. He told me how he first came to the Lord, of C.S. Lewis, how he hugged a tree in Raheny, and even prayed for Lucifer. He seemed to suggest that everyone would be saved, putting it in such a pagan way that the Christian I still was disquieted. The parameters of religious thinking ever-changing, a moving crosshair, yet always familiar, fervent and deranged, and yet pure. like in no one else I'd ever meet. The propensity and the skill to believe in belief at all. Telling your child that a dark spirit dwelt in them, and that that was love. And it was. It was love. Why shouldn't good people make these grave choices too? Why shouldn't I need to be exercised, knowing the self I know now and have become? There was nothing that was ever going to be more mine, because I came from him and I was his. We were linked like sutures across a wound. Only we two would ever experience each other as we had, each one's representation of the other, unique to our respective vantage points. We were organs in each other's bodies. We lived through one another together in a mutual world only we populated. We couldn't give it away if we tried, and I have, but it turns to anger in my outstretched hand. Anger is a trance state. Now I wail through A&E yet again from the pain, and I thrash about the gurney. Nurses jump from their seats at the results of a match playing from a phone. A woman named Martina holds my hand. I had a face mask on and an eye mask on to block out the fluorescent daggers thrust from the ceiling, so I never actually saw her. She had what I had. A man named Michael stood watch over me, an angel down the hall, lifting me back into bed when I'd fallen out from the pain, and paced the psychedelic pebble dash of the linoleum. And there it was. Time behaves differently in a hospital. Night is just a word for when it's quieter, for when they send you home. With another prescription for opioids, saying that there's little else to be done. My mother drives me back, an ichthyosis in her rear window, swimming fixed like a cataract over the road. A ghost estate we pass rises into the sun, leaving its tarmac halo behind for the traffic to feast on. She quietly babbles in tongues to herself for our elusive healing. She too carries the weight of living to an unknowable term, insisting upon its fallenness and its beauty, that God is good and that no adversity would be wasted. I sent an email that night to a euthanasia clinic in Switzerland, planning for futures unspoken but altogether possible. In any eventuality, I was changed. I understood what I was, and it was less than I had tried to will. I contemplated the night itself from the vast and intimate distance from shadow to shadow, from sickness to health, and body to the mind. Or by then, lack thereof. I missed my life. I missed who I was before the pain. I am becoming insane again now, muffling my wails in the night so as not to wake anyone. I spend my days guiding myself from moment to moment through an exponential pulse spreading from the east of the body with the naked knowledge that it may never stop. Each moment a moving target dancing in the face of our experience, wreaking their little havocs on the soul, inflicting change upon the body, burrowing into and muddying the composition of our DNA. I need not withhold myself from the eternal recurrence happening to me, just as now I can happen to it. I could remind myself that next year I'd be 29, that Saturn would return, that who I'd come to be was reliant on recognition, an unspoken act of definition on the part of others that I wanted suddenly no more part in. I didn't want a story, a past from which to prospect a future, a perpetual fiction inspired by reality, told to myself, by myself, at the speed of perception. So I took my so-called self and crushed it beneath my heel. I'd probably even a year from now still lead a quiet life in the light of a Velux, each same day but different, locked in a comprehensive migraine diary. I knew what loneliness was, and what it did to those who are brave out of necessity, the more or less harmless insanities one becomes privy to. Pain is the colour of my body, the anchor under my bow, the stars and their night that only my brain can see, visions visited upon me from some divine yonder, without invitation, but loyal to me, if not to the story that, really, only I can believe. So I think aloud, away back in time, to a world without chloroform.